Do you worry much about what critics say about your performances, whether they're favourable or unfavourable?
No, I don't think one can. And in this, I'm not making an attack on critics. They face an almost impossible task, and I'm sure a lot of them perform this task sincerely and in a way they think just. But you see, an artist must believe in himself and mustn't be easily swayed by things of this kind. And I've always adopted as a creed of my profession that a public man must take whatever comes to him. If he chooses to read these things, he can. If he chooses not to read them, which I think is the best, he doesn't. But in any case, it must not swerve him from his convictions, because an artist can only be true to himself. I've never answered a critic except on a statement of fact. I believe in what I do. I may be right, I may be wrong. But you have, at any rate, for good or ill, the best that I can make of what gifts have been given me.
Now, what do you find that the conductor needs in dealing with an orchestra? Indeed, how did you become trained as a conductor yourself?
Well, my dear CB, you cannot train anybody to be a conductor. And I will say to my dying day that conductors are born and not made. You see, there are certain aspects of the art of conducting, technical things like score reading, balance. These things can be taught in a way. But that intangible thing which makes one conductor make an orchestra sound one way and another, that is something that nobody can ever explain. And I think the best analogy I can make there is that if you take an absolutely first-class orchestra and two absolutely first-class conductors, they can each make that orchestra sound entirely different. Now, they're the same men playing on the same instruments. How can you account for that fact? So that you see the actual physical act of conducting is something that must be absolutely second nature. For instance, I've never held a stick in my hand except when I'm actually conducting. And the best proof of this, I think I can give in the fact that when I made my debut as an opera conductor, I had never conducted an orchestra larger than my little chamber orchestra of 11 string players. And the first week I conducted Romeo and Juliet of Gounod, Aida and Madame Butterfly, and I had 3.5 hours rehearsal for the lot. And I remember some of the older lags, let's call them, in the orchestra, said that I was absolutely like an old routine opera conductor. Well, I can tell you all this without any sense of boasting, because it's nothing to do with me. Somebody put it there, the good Lord, or whatever you like to call the deity that does it. I have to study very hard to learn my music. I spend hours, days, months, years studying scores. But once the music is in my head, it's translated to my arm automatically. And that, I still say, is the only real conductor.
Do the audiences help you at all? A sympathetic audience, does that help to make the translation any quicker or more effective?
Not in a physical sense. It can help you emotionally, perhaps, to give of your best. And that's why I've always refused to teach conducting. I've got pupils who would come for me from all over the world to have lessons, and I refuse to do it because I'm going to use a nasty word now. I think it's a swindle. I could teach them certain aspects of that, but the one that they want to learn from me, which I know I can't teach them unless they've got it, and then in that case they don't need teaching, is their power over the player. In short, it's a quality of leadership, allied, of course, to great musical knowledge and sensitivity.
Do you still play the cello?
Yes, occasionally. I find it great relaxation to do a little cooking sometimes, because my mother was really a genius at that, and the little I know, I've culled from her, and I make quite a few rather respectable dishes that I find a little rich for myself, but my friends seem to enjoy, and like playing chamber music. I find that it really does me an awful lot of good. For instance, when I was conducting the Chicago Orchestra, and between rehearsals with the Mahler Ninth Symphony, we got some boys together and we played a Brahms sextet and a Mozart two viola quintet, and we had a lovely evening. I remember rather amusedly the first viola after the first movement of the Mozart quintet suddenly will burst out with, I must say rather surprisingly, "Boy, can that man play cello?"
Sir John, what is it in music that has somehow compelled you to give your energies so passionately to it, and with such indefatigable energy which would have almost paralyzed 2 or 3 normal men for nearly half a century?
I think, CB, the only other profession which would have attracted me is that one of medicine. When I say this to people, they say, "Well, thank God you became a musician." And I don't think I regret one moment of all that music has cost me. And here, perhaps to some budding young conductors, I would like to say this. If you take on this mighty task, don't think it's just a thrill of a ball shirt, applause. You must be ready to sacrifice your whole existence to it. I was translated to the rostrum from the orchestra pit almost overnight, and although I knew a lot of operas and symphonies, having played them, it's a very different story when you come to study them in detail. I was fortunate enough to make an instantaneous success with my opera work, but of course my repertoire had to grow. And I remember my early days in the BNOC, I'd go down in the morning, perhaps have my own orchestral rehearsal with the singers. In the afternoon, I would start studying a new opera. That evening, I would either be conducting or I would take charge of the music on the stage. I'd go home, have my supper, and then I would ask the hotel I was in to call me at 4 o'clock so that I could do some swatting before I went to the next morning rehearsal. And that is a really hard grind, because like a man who wants to become a great surgeon, is not only the thrill of getting all dressed up, but you have to know your anatomy. And with us in music, we've got to know our scores, and perhaps what leads you so passionately to devote your life to this thing we call music is that the greatest utterings of the great masters are things which are almost unfathomable. And to my dying day, I know I will seek ever to get nearer and nearer to perhaps what the Ninth Symphony of Beethoven means.